In 1973, under President Nixon, the federal government set up 5 drug classifications based on risk, Schedule 1 being the most dangerous. What is considered a Schedule 1 drug? Marijuana, LSD, and heroin. What is a Schedule 2 drug? Cocaine. What is a Schedule 3 drug? Anabolic steroids. What is a Schedule 4 drug? Valium. Schedule 5 drugs are considered the least risky. What is considered the least risky drug? Cough preparations with less than 200 milligrams of codeine. And what drugs are not scheduled at all? Alcohol and cigarettes. Why does the federal government consider tobacco and alcohol a low risk and marijuana a high risk? If you answered "I don't know," you answered right. We don't know either. End prohibition now.
My name is Jack A. Cole. I'm a retired detective lieutenant from the New Jersey State Police. I served 26 years there. For 14 of those years, I worked undercover in narcotics. And nothing I did in that entire 26 years reduced the number of drug abusers in this country by so much as one person. As a matter of fact, it made it far, far worse. It is a self-perpetuating, constantly expanding policy disaster. Every year it's worse than it was the year before, and we've been making it worse now for 45 years. In that 45 years, it's cost us dearly. We've spent more than $1.5 trillion on this war. And you know what we have to show for it? Basically, it's just this. In that 45 years, we've made more than 50 million arrests for non-violent drug offenses. 50 million. I mean, think about that. Some countries don't have 50 million people. We've made 50 million arrests for non-violent drug offenses, and we've done everything we can possibly do to destroy the lives of the people we arrest. There's 3 reasons why the war exists: money, power, and racism. That's why it started, and that's why it exists today. And if you want to know about the racism, if your audience wants to know who uses and who sells drugs in the United States, it's very easy to find out. You go to the Federal Household Survey that's done every year, and what that says is that 72% of the people using and selling drugs look just like me, a bunch of white guys. Only 13.5% of those folks are black folks. And you know, according to all the studies, blacks are just about as likely to use drugs as white, but no more likely to use drugs than whites. But now who gets arrested? Across the United States, 37% of all the people arrested for drug violations are black. And who goes to prison? In our state prisons, 60% of all the people there serving time for drug violations are black. And in our federal prison system, it's 81%. They're only 13% of the problem. When I retired, I felt so bad about my role in implementing the war on drugs. Felt so bad about the fact that about 1,000 young people went to prison as a direct result of what I had done out there as one undercover agent. Young folks who, most of them had never even committed any other crime in their life other than the fact that they wanted to put something in their body that I don't want to put in mine. So we sent them to prison for that. So I really felt bad about it. So I sat down with 4 other police officers, and we created Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. On our way to creating it, we tried to figure out what we as law enforcers should really be interested in doing. And when we boiled it down to the essence, we decided there's 4 things that law enforcers should be interested in reducing: death, disease, crime, and addiction. And sadly, Michael, all 4 of those categories are just made infinitely worse by the war on drugs. So that certainly wasn't what we want. What we decided we do want is reflected in our name, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We want to end prohibition of the currently illicit drugs around the world today, just like we ended alcohol prohibition in this country in 1933. Because looking at that terrible law from the viewpoint of law enforcers, we understand that the day after we ended alcohol prohibition, Al Capone and all his smuggling buddies were out of business. Next morning, they were done. They were no longer out there killing each other to control that very lucrative market. They were no longer killing our children caught in crossfire and drive-by shootings. They were no longer even killing cops charged with fighting that useless war. So we know that if we were to legalize all these drugs, we could end this prohibition violence, this terrible gun violence. It'd be over. And then once we've legalized it, and only once we've legalized it, we could regulate these drugs. You can't regulate or control anything while it's illegal. So you legalize it, then you regulate it. Once we regulate it, wonderful things will happen. We can prevent overdose deaths from drugs. Nobody has to die of an overdose. In the 14 years I worked undercover with those folks, I heard and saw a lot of overdose deaths. I never heard of one person dying because they shot more and more dope. It doesn't happen. They die because they simply don't know how much that tiny little package of powder they're buying is really the drug and how much is the cutting agent. Too much drug and you're dead. You know, it takes, for instance, heroin takes 8 milligrams to get you high. It takes 50 milligrams to kill you. So that's a 1 to 6 average there. And when you're shooting a package of dope that you think might be 10% pure and it turns out to be 60% pure, you're dead. It's just as simple as that. We want to save their lives, and we can do that by regulating these drugs. We'll still have an addicted person, but the person will know what they're taking and stay alive. And that is, there's nothing more important than that, because if you can keep them alive, you've got a chance to wean them off the drugs. And you show me any parent that lost a child, and I'll guarantee you they'd rather have an addicted child than a dead child, all right? Because with an addicted child, you got some hope for the future. Let me tell you how poor a policy it is. Back when I started working undercover, that was the beginning of the war on drugs. It was 1970. And in 1970, we didn't need a war on drugs. If you look at the statistics from that year, you'll find that the likelihood of anybody dying in this country as a result of the drug culture, you'll find that it was less likely that that would happen than them dying from falling down the steps in their own home. Less likely than choking to death on your own food at dinner, but we started a war on drugs, right? So you gotta wonder, why in the world did we do such a thing? We really didn't have a drug problem in 1970. What little problem we had was basically soft drugs, marijuana, hashish, some LSD, psilocybin, the mushrooms, the mind-bending drugs, right? Hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine were virtually unheard of in 1970, certainly unheard of compared to what they are today. And the way I can show your audience this is to tell them, remind them. And by the way, I have to remind them, it's got to be an old coot like me that reminds them, because I'm 77 years old. You've got to be my age to have lived in the United States when we didn't have a war on drugs, right? This has been going on for 2 generations, 45 years. Most of the people alive today have never experienced the United States without a war. So in 1970, when we started it, there just weren't a lot of drug dealers out there. And thanks to Richard Nixon, who started the war on drugs.
President Nixon, who coined the phrase war on drugs, was the driving force behind today's marijuana laws. As a public service, we'd like to share a quote taken from the actual recordings made in the Oval Office.
Every one of those bastards that are out for legalizing marijuana is Jewish. What the Christ is the matter with the Jews, Bob? I suppose it's because most of them are psychiatrists.
That's right, Mr. President. They're all psychiatrists. So what do you propose we do about marijuana?
I want to hit it right square in the puss.
Very presidential, sir, right in the puss. But your own commission suggested that private possession of marijuana should no longer be criminalized.
The commission's frankly just a bunch of do-gooders.
That doesn't sound very presidential, but I'll tell you what is: ending prohibition. I know you can do it. End prohibition now.
He got the U.S. Congress to give massive funding bills, give tremendous amounts of money to any police department willing to hire cops to fight his war. I'll tell you how huge these things were. When I joined the state police, it was 1964. We had 1,700 troopers. We had a 7-man narcotic unit. Always seemed perfectly adequate. 6 years later, we had exactly those numbers. It was enough. We didn't have a problem. And then in 1970 in October, when I went into narcotics, we went from a 7-man narcotic unit to a 76-person narcotic bureau overnight, all paid for by the federal government. And this was replicated across the whole United States. So what happens when you take a police organization with one job and you increase its size by 11 times its size? Well, in the next year, we were expected to make at least 11 times more arrests. And that was really hard in 1970 because there weren't a lot of drug dealers out there.
Right.
Not like it is today. So what they did was diabolical. And my bosses knew that we had to show numbers. We had to show that the war on drugs was so necessary that the feds would keep paying the bill for all these 76 troopers they hired, right? To replace us guys they brought in to be narcs. How do you do that when there's really not much of a drug problem? Well, you lie a lot. And it becomes a numbers game. And you have to go out and make arrests as fast as you can make arrests. To find real drug dealers, you had to go to the largest cities in the United States. So that would be New York City on our east or Philadelphia on our west. And we weren't working those. So we had, of the 76 narcs we had, 25 of us became undercover agents. And we were working the suburbs of New Jersey. I was working between 5 and 20 miles outside of Manhattan here. There weren't any drug dealers out there. So instead of targeting us on real drug dealers, they targeted us on young people. Young people in college, young people in high school, or in between. And when I'd weasel my way into a small friendship group of 10 or 15 of these young people, and I'd become their friend, come Friday night, somebody might say, hey, we're out of school, for the weekend, we're off job. Let's get high. And if nobody said that, that was my job. And if anybody took me up on this offer, then one of the friends who happened to have access to the family car or some other way to get to New York City would go around to the other friends and say, hey, you want to get high? And somebody might say, well, nah, I'm studying for a test Monday. I'll catch you next time. But others would say, yeah, while you're in the city, pick me up a couple joints, will you? A couple joints. Or somebody might say, I hear there's some really good blotter acid out there. If you run across anyone you're in the city, buy me a hit of blotter acid, 1 dose of blotter acid. When they'd come to me, I'd put my order in for the same tiny little bit of drugs because I want to look like them, right? We're talking $5 worth of drugs. They'd jump in the car, off they'd go to the city. An hour later, they'd come back and they'd hand the drugs out to their friends. When they handed it to me, they became a big-time drug dealer because that's what we labeled them, and that is what stuck. And of course, I wouldn't arrest them. I'm undercover. I would just keep making cases. I'd make cases on this friendship group till I got every single person in the group, and it was really easy to do. Because these people were not drug dealers. They were young people who were doing what we used to call dipping and dabbing, right? Experimenting with drugs, and then accommodating their friends so that 15 people didn't have to go to the city. One person go and buy for every. They weren't getting any money for this. They weren't even getting their gas money back. So the person that made the run the first night wasn't going to make the run the next night. Then it's person B, person C, person D. I stayed there till I had a case on every single person. And I might be working 10 of these friendship groups simultaneously in different suburbs. So it didn't take long. About every 2 months, I would come in with maybe cases on 100 people. And would have a big raid. Swoop into their communities with hundreds of cops, kick down their doors at 5 o'clock in the morning. Kick down their doors and drag them, and we literally did, kick down their doors. All we had was body worn. We would kick down their doors, go in, search the place, drag them out in chains. If we found any drugs in the place, everybody went. And since these were young people, that meant their mother, their father, their sister, their brother, everybody's under arrest. When we got them all down to the police station, we would have already alerted the reporters to be there with their cameras, to take their pictures in that perp lock and splash them all over the front pages of their local newspapers, destroying any credibility, any respectability these young people had. And then when we got them all lined up against that back wall, my boss would come out. He'd say to the reporters, you see that? There's 100 major drug dealers we took out of your community. Major drug dealers, right? And he'd say, this is the worst thing that's ever happened in the United States. This is going to destroy society as we know it. And the only protection you have is that thin blue line of cops. We need more money so we can hire more cops. We need more money so we can buy faster cars. We need better radio communications. We need surveillance equipment. We need bulletproof vests. We need guns that shoot a whole bunch of bullets. We need harsher laws. We need mandatory minimum sentences for drug laws. We need 3 strikes you're out for drug laws. We need. And the reporters would go away and write horror stories, scaring the public to death. And the people out there would pick up that newspaper the next morning and read that story and say, give it to them. Give it to them. And then we'd go out and do even worse. Let me take the time to tell you what happened to those young people. And think, these are young people just like yourself. Man. Folks who are in the prime of their life trying to get their education, and we snatch them off the streets. We only had one law back then for drugs. It said it's illegal to distribute a controlled dangerous substance. Then it named a big line of substances. There was no differentiation between hard drugs and soft drugs. There was no differentiation between 40 pounds of a substance or a roach. There was not even any differentiation or indication that any money had to change hands. The mere handing of one marijuana cigarette from one person to another made the person that's handing it a drug dealer.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, indeed. Well, let me tell you what happened to these folks. Because of this, because of one law, every one of these people was sentenced to exactly the same thing, 7 years in prison. 100 of them about every 2 months I was bringing in. 7 years in prison. Now in New Jersey, you have to serve 1/3 of max before you come out. So that meant roughly 2.5 years after I would hold each one of these raids, another 100 people is hitting the street coming out of prison. How are they going to make a living? How are they going to feed their family? We snatched them off the street in the prime of their life when they're trying to get their education. They don't have any education, and even if they did, who the hell is going to hire them? They're drug dealers. That's what we said they were. Nobody's going to hire a drug dealer. So what are they going to do? They're going to turn right back to this drug culture, the very group we say we're trying to save them from, only now they're going to become, honest to goodness, real drug dealers. And for every new real drug dealer you got on the street, you got to have a whole bunch of new real drug users to support them. So each one of these people, 2.5 years after I arrest them, is out there recruiting younger people every day to pick up those needles and become the next statistic. You see, this is how this thing became a self-perpetuating, constantly expanding policy disaster. There is no way to fix it. We have to end it. We have to end the war. We have to end drug prohibition. The best way to make sure is to tell the truth, to start telling the truth. That's what LEAP does. You know, I said I started with 4 other cops. Well, it's 13 years later, and we're no longer 5 cops. We're well over 150,000 police, judges, prosecutors, prison officials. We've got supporters in 120 countries. We were just accepted by the United Nations last April as an NGO with consultant status to them. So now we have access to the International Commission on Narcotic Drugs, to their meetings. And the very first thing we did when we got that access was we submitted a proposal for an amendment. Of course, we can't do it, but we put the proposal in. We got to get one country to pick it up and submit it officially, and it will be an amendment that they'll have to deal with and vote on. And what this, it's a 45-page amendment. It's very, very well written because we've got a lot of judges and prosecutors in LEAP that all went over it. But it's very simple what it says. Basically, it says that if the amendment is accepted, from now on, every member state, I think there's 186 member states in the UN, every member state will once again have the right to self-determination. They'll be able to decide for themselves if they want all the drugs that the United States say are illegal, be illegal in their country. Or maybe if they want to legalize cannabis, let them experiment. Or maybe if they want to legalize it all, let them experiment. Michael, that's exactly what happened in this country when we ended alcohol prohibition. When we ended alcohol prohibition, the federal government didn't say alcohol is now legal. They just said, we're no longer in the equation. This is up to each state to decide whether they want it legal or not. And we had 48 experiments going on, each in a different state. And when you get that kind of thing going, you know, it worked better in some states than other states, and pretty soon everybody realized the best way to work it is to end prohibition completely, and then use regulation and control. Again, tell them the truth, because the truth hadn't been told. You know, they started out with things like reefer madness, and it hasn't changed a whole lot since then. When I grew up, that's what I watched, movies like Reefer Madness or Man with a Golden Arm, you know, and I believed every word of it. But now we know better, and everything was given to us on an emotional level back then. And now we have science, and we can figure out what really is going on and what really isn't going on. You tell people about this. You explain to them that cannabis or marijuana is less dangerous than peanuts. You know, which is a fact. Every year in the United States, about 60 people die from ingesting peanuts. There's never been a single person in all recorded history that died from ingesting marijuana, so apparently marijuana is less dangerous than peanuts. So when you start telling the truth about this stuff, people say, oh, you mean the sky's not falling, right? Well, maybe we can change things, and that's what's happening. That's why we have 4 states now in the District of Columbia that have legalized marijuana even for recreational purposes. And come 2016, I would bet you that number will double. Because it has a lot to do with money. And look what happened in Colorado. Look at all that money they raised through taxes. And once they legalized marijuana, all this tax money was coming in. Other great things happened. Crime dropped. Crime dropped after they legalized there. All opiate deaths are down 25% in all the states that had even legalized medical marijuana by the year 1998. It's down 25%. So, and that's going to really happen in states that have legalized marijuana for recreational purposes, you know? So many of these people using hard drugs are self-medicating. They've got real problems. I mean, they got many mental issues. People don't use hard drugs because, oh boy, it's fun. They use it because their life is kind of screwed up, and they want to just forget about that for the time being, you know? So if they can do the same thing by using a more benign drug like marijuana, you keep them alive, you know? That's paramount. Keep them alive. We really help people who are alcoholics. If they'll go to rehab, we not only will send them, but we'll pay for. Usually, it's their corporation that they're an employee of pays for their rehabilitation. Why don't we do the same thing to people addicted to other drugs? You know? Save their lives. Give them hope for the future, and you wouldn't have nearly as many people using drugs. So everything we're doing is just the opposite. And I'll show you how opposite it is. When I started working on the war on drugs, kicking doors in 1970, as a young trooper, we measured our largest drug seizures, our largest individual drug seizures in pounds. That was a big thing when you could get a pound of anything. Today, what do we measure them in?
Tons?
Tons. 15 tons of methamphetamine, one seizure. 20 tons of cocaine, one seizure. 23 tons of heroin, one seizure. And believe it or not, Michael, 242 tons of marijuana, one seizure. Now let me tell you what happens the night after each one of these humongous seizures on the streets. Nothing. The price didn't change by so much as 1 penny. And I'll guarantee you the night that any one of these huge drug seizures happened, nobody went to bed without their drug of choice. That's how we are being inundated by these drugs today. There's just no way to stop it. Drug warriors say if we keep fighting this war, the potency of these hard drugs will go down. Well, actually, the potency has gone up. When I started buying heroin on the streets of New Jersey, like every other undercover cop, they would analyze what I was buying, and that powder that was being sold to us as heroin, only 1.5% of that powder was actually heroin. The rest was cutting agent. Today, according to DEA, the minimum average out in the streets is 60% pure. So that's a problem 40 times greater than it was when we started the war, right? And because of that, heroin overdoses are 18 times worse than they were when we started the war on drugs. And drug use, if what we're trying to do is prevent drug abuse, I don't know, it's a weird way to go about it. Mm-hmm. DEA was created in 1973. And the first job they assigned those folks was to go back before the war on drugs and try to estimate how many drug users we had in this country above the age of 12 who had ever used an illegal drug. And after a lot of studies, they came up with a figure that they thought was right, which was about 4 million people who had ever used an illegal drug before we started the war. Today, DEA tells us we have 121 million people above the age of 12 who've ever used an illegal drug. Now, 4 million people above the age of 12 in 1970, that was 2% of that possible population. 121 million today above the age of 12 is 46% of this population. So we went from 2% users to 46% users under a war on drugs. It's hard for me to even contemplate how we could have come up with a worse policy if what we really want to do is reduce drug abuse. I mean, what could be worse than this? First thing we have to do is we have to legalize and regulate these drugs so we're not adding more people to this problem and by arresting them and imprisoning them. Once we do that, I think, and the people at LEAP think, that we should release anybody in prison that's there for a nonviolent drug offense. They shouldn't be there, period. if they're bad folks, we'll catch them again doing something bad and we'll throw them back in prison. We're supposed to be a country that believes in second chances for people, but we don't give anybody involved with drugs second chances. Let's let them out. We've got more people in prison today than any country in the world per capita. We believe in punishment in the United States. That's our big problem. We think if somebody does something wrong, you lock them up, throw away the key, and you solve the problem. But all you've done is created a greater problem. So, and again, the money comes into it. Because we've arrested so many people, 50 million in 45 years, because now we have 2.2 million people in prison. It was 2.3 million, but we're starting to come down a little bit because I think people are starting to listen to LEAP, and they're starting to change things a little. But even with 2.2 million people in prison, we have had 37 of our 50 states have already passed laws saying it is okay to use prison population to produce goods for corporations. 37 states say this is okay. So our prisons have virtually become the new slavery. And speaking of slavery, we now have more black men in prisons than we had slaves in 1840. And Michael, they're doing exactly the same work, only instead of working for the corporations or the plantations, they're working for the corporations. And so much so that now we have spawned prisons for profit. And these prisons for profit love this thing. And they've worked out a deal where they're in 28 states already, and they've worked out a deal with most of the states that once they go and they built this prison, the state has to guarantee that 95% of the beds will be filled, because if they drop below that, they got to pay for those beds anyway. So what's that telling the people that run the state? Go out and arrest more people. Keep those beds full, because we're going to have to pay for them anyway, right? It is just diabolical. And the corporations that use prison labor, they couldn't be happier, because they only have to pay them between 16 and 28 cents an hour. There's no overtime, there's no weekends or holidays, there's certainly no vacation pay, and health care they don't have to pick up. The health care is picked up by our taxes. So these people couldn't be happier, right? And they've created all these jobs inside the prisons. So what happens when the prisoner finally gets out? Can't find any work to do, because all the work that he's trained to do is inside the prison. We've got to change so many things here, but it's all based on treat drug abuse as a health problem and treat these people like they're human beings. We start doing that, we'll make the changes.
Hey yo, positivity reigns and carries like a train. Take away your pain like killers. Some fill the liver with liquor, other puff their lungs full of skunking. To compensate for misplaced functions lost at the junction. Now I say life is more visible through a lit up eye. Sockets plugged into light receptors. We're not fueled by darkness, check the tanks empty. We need the sun to synthesize and grow to reach plenty.